for a lot of people, fitting in becomes a way of surviving,
Hmm.
right? But fitting in is not the same thing as belonging. You're kind of forced to fit in, you conform, you assimilate, but that doesn't always mean that you belong.
What if the key to transformation lies in shifting your perspective? Hi, I'm Dr. Payal Beri. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives. Every conversation here is about one thing: how empathy changes the way we lead, connect, and create impact. Each episode, we get to explore deep, authentic conversations designed to expand your mindset. Whether you're looking to transform your leadership, deepen your relationships within your circle, your community, and friends, or gain clarity in your own personal growth, each episode will inspire you to see things differently and take action. If you're ready to challenge your thinking and embrace transformation, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. There is no other episode that has been this deeply personal, where I felt like a mirror was being held up. I got to interview Dr. Ammara Khalid, and she's a psychologist who, similar to me, is a third culture kid, moved around the whole world, and by no coincidence, found herself fascinated by the sense of belonging and humanity and human behavior. And we dug deep on this episode because she's currently researching and writing a book about the generational trauma that has been experienced because of the partition in South Asia, India, Pakistan, and later Bangladesh, and what that really did to us as a society, internationally, immigrants, South Asian descent living across US, Australia, Canada, England. And what was so fascinating is also that when the partition happened, Dr. Amara had her family moved from the India side to Pakistan, and my family moved from Pakistan to India. And we both actually had our families move from the exact same towns and areas that we were each from in India and Pakistan, moved to the other side. But yet neither one of us have been able to go to the other side because of the tensions and conflict. And so much of what she's learning is also so connected to what's happening today when we look at our immigration policies, when we look at what's happening culturally across the world and right here at home in the United States. So I hope when you listen to this episode, you're not just hearing about the psychological responses, but you're also hearing about two individuals, a Pakistani and an Indian, who have very similar stories and are pining for the exact same thing of belonging and finding a way back to each other. It's so great to have you here on this podcast. In preparing to talk to you, there was so much that was coming up for myself because I literally have not had any person that I have interviewed that there's so much mirroring happening. And I'm just really excited to talk about because your life has just been so fascinating and interesting. And the work that you're doing, it feels deeply personal to me. And so I'm really using this selfishly to ask you all the questions to understand even myself a little bit better through the lens of work that you're doing, because I think the work that you're doing is just so, so important. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
So, Amara, you talked about when we first connected, it was just, there's so many things that you were saying that was like, oh my gosh, me too, me too. And, one being a third culture kid, something that you mentioned, it's like, you were flying before you were talking. And that is similar. My first flight ever was, I was 6 days old. And similar, like, I'm a third culture kid. And I'm just so curious. First of all, I think it's important to kind of define what that even means to you. Like, what does being a third culture kid mean to you and in the work that you're doing?
Funny thing is, I had never heard the term third culture kid or TCK until I came to the US when I moved here when I was 18 to go to college.
Hmm.
Before that, I was born in Pakistan, in Karachi, and my parents were born there. My grandparents migrated from India, both sides. So my dad's side is from Delhi, my mom's side is from Lucknow. And I was 8 years old when we moved to Italy. We had moved to Paris briefly when I was around one, but then came back and then we moved to Italy for 3 years. So I was in Rome for a year, Milan for 2 years, then came back to Karachi, then moved to Saudi Arabia for 4 years. And then I moved to the US. So it's really interesting because I've been both part of the majority culture and the minority culture. I've been the new kid and I've been the returning kid. And it was just such a weird experience in middle school and high school. I mean, there's so much going on at that time, anyways. But to be trying to understand, how do I fit in? How can I belong? How do I make friends? How do I maintain friends, right? Before the
Yeah.
smartphones and whatnot. So there were a lot of different challenges in that, but being immersed in new cultures and coming back to my own, I think it allowed me to celebrate similarities as much as I celebrate differences. And that's been a really strong tenet of mine. And that's why I see people in my practice from all walks of life. And I can find those pieces that we just relate to on the basis of our humanity. So I really enjoy working with a diverse population in that way. And when I came here as a student, I was on an F1 visa in the beginning. I was an international student, eventually got my green card along the way, eventually got my citizenship along the way. And I had my undergrad from NYU, both in psychology as well as gender and sexuality. And then I got my doctorate here at the Illinois School of Professional Psychology. And so I've been in Chicago now for over 15 years.
So a big portion of your life has just been in the US though. It's like if you think about prior to that, the 18 years. So similar, but a little different is I never lived in India. And, so my third culture experience was I was born in Sharjah in UAE. I was, lived in Iraq, lived in Dubai, grew up in Egypt, moved to, Queens, New York as welcome to America, like at 8, and moved to Tampa, moved to Edison, moved to Australia, came to California and been in California. But I came at, I would say like I settled at the age of 10 is when we came here. But those first 10 years were so formative in exactly what you're talking about, that celebration of differences, the curiosity. I feel like, both you and I going into psychology is by no coincidence.
No
It's just,
coincidence.
right? It's what you're fed. But you mentioned something earlier about that, like finding your belonging. I've always struggled with what that means, especially as a third culture kid. And similar to you, I didn't actually know that word until after college, but how do you find your belonging for yourself? For, when you think about all these experiences that you've had, what does belonging mean for you?
I think for me, it's always about people and connection. Chicago is home because I've been here for so long, but also the reason why I ended up here is because my grandparents moved here. And they were actually the first to move in our family. And then I moved, and my parents actually moved after me. So when people ask me, are you first gen or second gen? I'm like, I think we're all kind of first gen. Like three generations of my family are first gen. And now, the kiddos are the fourth gen is they're born here. But I think having such a massive network here is such a source of support, because having four generations of my family here means that our birthdays, anniversaries, Thanksgiving is like 70 people, three turkeys, two pot roasts. Like it's a wedding, right? Like
Yeah.
so our family gatherings are massive, and everyone's kind of spread out all over the Chicagoland suburbs, but we're all in touch, and that really fulfills that sense of belonging. But I also really felt a deep connection to New York, and I think because it's one of those magnetic cities where no matter where you're from, anyone can belong there. You may hear your language in any different neighborhood or something and find your food, and those are all things that help us belong. And so it was very easy for me to adjust to living in New York because I felt very international. I've never felt like I'm just one thing, and that really helped me make connections in New York, and I love going back there and visiting. So I think for me it's about people, it's about connection, but all of the other things too, like food and music. And I think for a lot of people, fitting in becomes a way of surviving,
Hmm.
right? But fitting in is not the same thing as belonging. You're kind of forced to fit in, you conform, you assimilate, but that doesn't always mean that you belong. And I think a lot of people, especially BIPOC folks, feel that in this country now more than ever.
Oh God, there's so many things I want to like. I have four questions I want to come out at the same time, but like everything you touch on, one is makes sense, right? Like people is where you find your community. It's like you could live in New York City, but if you don't actually have community for yourself, it can be the loneliest place. And the same thing can happen in any other city in the world, right? And so having that community, the people that you feel safe with, people who you can celebrate with, have joy with, like, and that's such a huge part of it. And I find it so interesting that, like, you've got this 4 generations living in Chicago, which resembles what you had in Pakistan growing up in a joint family. But I think that there's so much power that, I think we're seeing this more and more here in the US and Western societies now because of inflation, because of pricing. More and more joint families are starting to come together. There's appreciation of that. But for the most part, individualistic culture doesn't necessarily support that. And actually, I would take it further that I think it's more of embedded in capitalism. And the
Oh,
culture of capitalism doesn't support that there should be an already built-in community for you because they want you to buy your community. And so as you think about like the work that you do with your patients with, and especially going on right now, how do you help them like find that community, appreciate that they actually have a village around them, that they don't necessarily need to feel that they have to go off on their own and then build that through, purchasing power?
well, I tell folks that it takes being a good village to have a good village,
Mm.
right? So,
Yes, being a villager and the village.
yes, you have to show up for things. You have to maintain those connections. And it doesn't have to be in any grand way. Sometimes it means helping a friend move, or it means, checking in or offering to bring a meal or something, just small things. But, speaking of capitalism, like think about how houses are structured here, right? Like they're very individual. You have these houses in a row that kind of all look the same, frankly. They're not really designed for communal living. I moved into my home in the middle of COVID, which I was like, okay, it's going to be impossible to meet new people, of course. I've been here for several years now, and still, like, there's not a lot of interaction with my neighbors. And I don't know if that's because of the post pandemic world that we just live in, where everyone's kind of retreated, but I think it's the sense of there's not a lot of community activity, and people also don't have time. We're too busy being toxically productive and work, work, work. So there's no time to engage in community building and gathering. And I think people are fighting that, and they're trying to find ways to, especially when you're new to a city, right? Like, how do I meet people? I know people who moved here like over a year ago and are still struggling to figure out where do I go. So I'm like, maybe you take an improv class, maybe you have a hobby or something, and you can find a group that does that. Because not everyone wants to go to a bar or a restaurant and meet people that way. So it's very challenging in the world that we live in right now to find time to create authentic, meaningful connections.
Yeah, and I think that we are definitely moving back into that. I feel like because of COVID, obviously we were all virtual, and then there's been this like big like uptick again of, where humans were craving that human in-person connection. But, when you mentioned that like being a villager, right? Help someone move, help like send them delivery if they're sick, whatever it may be. But I find that, and I see myself sometimes doing this too, where I don't want to impose, or, I don't want to seem that like, well, I can't get help myself, because I think that there is some degree of celebration of I did it on my own. I didn't need anybody. And because that idea again of like, I don't want to impose on someone else because we're all so busy, we're all so fatigued and tired. So, how do we get past that piece, especially if we're trying to build this community, trying to find belonging, trying to find connection with each other, but yet that there's still this barrier of, I don't want to impose?
Well, there's so many different ways to answer that. I think if we are going to talk about that sense of I did it myself,
Mhm.
being able to explore where does that really come from? Why is this, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, this rugged individualism that we all buy into, especially living in the West? Why is that so important? And how can that be harmful too? And I don't think that's completely divorced from class and caste, right? Like there's a sense of, well, why can't you just afford movers? Why do you need my help? Or there can be shame and embarrassment. And in America, talking about class, people get very sensitive. It's like, no, can we just all pretend we're all the same? And it's like, no, everyone has different means. And, some people struggle, and you may not know that because it's just shrouded in secrecy and shame. And especially in the South Asian community, I see this a lot. So, talking about money, talking about class, and how different people struggle with things can be, depending on how comfortable you are talking about money, it can be really hard to open up to people and ask for help or be vulnerable.
I think that you touched on something really interesting with the South Asian community. There is so much privacy, right? Privacy is so respected of like, okay, well, I'm going to keep that part private. In fact, when I was sharing the book that you're writing, which I cannot wait till it's published, but, just really exploring the South Asian generational trauma because of the partition. And you shared those questions with me, which I did to talk to my parents about it, and I definitely want to talk to you about it here. But when I was sharing that with other friends that belong to the South Asian diaspora, I'd be like, oh my gosh, this woman's writing this incredible book. Like, here are some questions. Do you think that you would answer it? And by the way, it's all anonymous. No one's going to
Yeah.
know your name. No one's going to know you. But still, they were just like, you know what? My family's very private. Like, they're not going to want their information out there. And it's just like, there is so much of this harboring of keep things close and tight to me. And I found it to be interesting because in one of your questions, in the questions that you asked for the book, was, what are some family secrets or what are some family documents? What are family things that have happened during that partition time? And even when I was asking my mom and my dad about like, similar, it was the grandparents that moved. So my family was from the Pakistan side, from Rawalpindi, and they moved over to Delhi and to Punjab. And I couldn't get them to, and not because they didn't want to. My parents are actually quite open, but they didn't have any. They wouldn't even know if there were secrets. They wouldn't even have any idea behind that. But then to share it, what do you think it is about this relationship of privacy and secrecy that you think is tied back to just this collective South Asian trauma that we have?
Well, that's part of the reason why I'm writing this book, because initially when I started to do my research, I thought, okay, there's been so many history books written. There are collections of oral histories and stories, both fiction, nonfiction. I thought, great, there's so much that I can read, but there was nothing written about it from a psychological perspective. And there's only been maybe two actual psychological studies that came out in 2023. So there's just not a lot that's been written about it. And part of the reason is that you need to have a little bit of distance from some painful historical events in order to be able to write about it. We've seen this happen with the Holocaust, with the Armenian genocide, things like that. But there's also not a lot of mental health professionals in South Asian community, right? We tend to become medical doctors or lawyers and engineers. So there's also not a lot of folk writing about it. And then you add the shame and secrecy when it comes to talking about mental health struggles, pain. Collectively, South Asians tend to be kind of geared towards, okay, let's just move on. Let's move past this. And in some ways, I think that was part of the survival strategy because so many people didn't even know what was going on at the time. They thought, okay, we'll relocate temporarily, and once the chaos dies down, we'll go back, we'll retrieve our belongings, or we'll see our family again. They didn't know that the borders would be closed. And then if you were living in communities where you didn't know people, you just had to move past it, right? You couldn't really talk about your struggles because everyone was struggling. People who were directly impacted by it, or even people who weren't, maybe if you were in South India, but still, there's still a lot of different aspects that flow in that culture during that time. And I think we also tend to be private because there's the element of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to ask these questions, and I've been asking these questions of four different generations, right? So it's really interesting to me to think about how boomers respond to me versus millennials versus Gen Z or Gen X. there has to be trust and I have to earn it. So people want to know, well, who are you? Where are you from? Why are you writing about this? What angle are you taking? There's a lot of suspicion.
Mm.
Understandably so. This is something really private. It is highly politically charged, as you saw what happened just a few months ago between
Oh,
India and Pakistan.
right.
So, not everyone is comfortable sharing because they don't know who I am, what my goal is, what my intentions are, how will I use their information. And so, even though I have taken great lengths to de identify all of these stories, I've changed names, locations, towns, I've put like five people's stories together in one. Like, there's no way that anyone would be able to say, aha, that's my story. It's been very difficult. And I had to make so many requests and contact so many people here in the UK, in the South Asian subcontinent to get stories. And I'm very, very grateful to the Citizens Archive or the Partition Archive at Berkeley because they've been doing this work for years. They've collected the stories. And so I'm using some of that data as well as I talk about all of the different ramifications that we see from one generation to the next. Because, the partition is not a single event, it's a whole series of events, right? We can't talk about generational trauma without talking about all the famine that we saw
Yeah.
in the 18th and 19th centuries and how that's impacted our physical health, our mental health, all of those things. So there's so many different pieces and layers to it. So the partition is sort of, it's not just about 1947. It's about what happened once the British came, what happened with all the princely states, and how that impacted families and beyond that too, because there were partitions after 1947, right? There was the liberation
Bangladesh.
of Bangladesh in 1971. There was the Sikh massacre in 1984. Conflict in Kashmir that has been ongoing. There's so many pieces that are still
Yeah.
unresolved.
Ethnic cleansing in Gujarat.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you touch on all these things, and it was so interesting because there's so many layers to this as well. Like you mentioned, the people who are not affected, for example, those who are in South India, or, like I have friends that their entire family was always on the India side and they didn't have to move over, they didn't have to come there. And the relationship that they have to the partition is so interesting. And I'm curious of what you have found because I have noticed, for example, like my family, when I asked my mom, I asked specifically when you would hear your grandparents talk because they moved over, they left everything in Rawalpindi and Kamalpur and Haranpur and all that and moved over to the India side. And I just remember, like, even last night I was talking to her about this, and I asked, because I remember my great grandmother, by the way. I met her. She was like 101 when she passed. But she came from a very, her mom was a princess. She came from a wealthy family. She was born in Kenya herself. She had like a very interesting life. And when they came over, I was like, was she, and they lost everything. So now they're living in a very middle class home. They don't have the Haveli, the big palace that they used to
Yeah.
have. And I asked her, did they have any anger towards that? Did you ever hear them be upset and angry that they had to lose everything? That now they're in this other part of this, like, in Delhi and, they're starting over again. And my mom and even my dad, I asked him for his side, and both of them said never. They never heard them being angry or upset. If anything, my father actually mentioned that when his father's brothers would come over and they would spend time together, they deeply remembered
Mm.
their community and their neighborhood and what it was like to live there and just how peaceful it was. They had Muslim neighbors, they had every kind of neighbor, and there wasn't an issue. And again, I think that's the biggest piece, is realizing that these issues that get stirred up, these aren't issues that are created by the everyday person. These are issues that are created for political gain, for some kind of corporate greed that, like, I consider corporation just another form of colonization. But, there is all of these greeds that are things that are stirring it up, and then they invoke that emotional response in people. But I noticed that friends who didn't have to go through the partition, they actually harbor more resentment towards that time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there are a lot of different theories about why and how things took place. I mean, the partition happened so quickly. The lines were drawn in haste by a group of elite folk who really didn't have much in common with the people that we're talking about, right? Like yeah,
Yeah,
every day.
like Punjab was just split in, like towns were just split in the middle without
Exactly.
realizing, like houses were like drawn a line drawn between houses.
People didn't know which books were going to stay in which library, which animals at the zoo were going to be divided. I mean, we could like there's so many layers of this and there was so much confusion, which is I think the impetus for a lot of fear, right? And that's where you see the violence, the riots. And my grandparents talk so fondly about their Hindu neighbors or their Sikh neighbors and how they would go to each other's festivals, right? Eid was celebrated together, Diwali was celebrated together. So going from that to then being sort of flung into the unknown, not knowing when you were going to go back. I mean, my Nana, who's in his 90s now, he still has family in Lucknow and I've never seen them.
Mhm.
You know, I
Yeah.
it's just, and it's one of those things where I'm like, will I ever even be allowed to go to India and see those places? I know which school my grandfather attended, and so it's like there's so much loss that's wrapped up in that too. And I think a lot of South Asians are grieving that loss, and that goes back to this question of identity and belonging, right? Because for those people that moved, they had to not only reinvent themselves, but there's a certain mindset, I call it the Mahajir mindset, Mahajir meaning refugee, which leads into other things like scarcity mindset and fear of the unknown. And I think the folks who went through it, there were a lot of folks that were experiencing, symptoms of PTSD and other things very acutely. So in those families where this was never talked about, it showed up in different ways. Maybe it showed up as domestic violence, maybe it showed up as substance abuse, maybe it showed up in anger and depression, anxiety. There was so much gendered violence, and
Yeah.
so this fear with women being raped. I mean, I have stories about women jumping into wells to preserve the family honor. One woman talked about carrying red chili powder with her on the train as a way to
Original
put it
pepper
in the,
spray.
yeah, the pepper spray idea, right? Like you throw it in the attacker's
Mhm.
eyes if something happens. And so those things weren't talked about, but that doesn't mean that they don't get passed on. They get passed on, epigenetically, as we know. It's transferred on a molecular level. And so that trauma then manifests in different ways in the second generation, folks who are interestingly, I would say, more patriotic, right? Because they were the original Pakistanis, or they were the new, generation that had a lot of nationalism to absorb. And it was this different way of existing. And so I think that generation tends to be really stoic. That's mostly the generation of our parents and aunts and uncles. There's a lot of stoicism there. And what gets passed on from them in the third generation are things like perfectionism, overachieving, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, workaholism. That scarcity mindset in a lot of ways still comes through. And then so much of the third generation has then gone into the diaspora, everywhere from Australia to UK to US, and then having to already have sort of the remnants from the partition, but then being an immigrant in a new country, having to adjust. And I think it's a very different experience for folks who move to the US, but for folks that move to the UK, they talk about how, we went to the colonizers, right? And our families settled there. And some families were in favor of all of the changes that the British brought about. And it was like they took on that persona. Like, yes, we only speak in English, and people forgot their own languages. So there's,
Yeah.
again, I keep coming back to the loss that so many families have had to experience, and there's just waves and waves of it that come up every time, someone opens the Pandora's box on this topic.
Hi, so I'm pausing the episode for a quick moment and for a quick favor. If you haven't already, if you could just click subscribe, leave a review wherever you're listening to this episode, it would be really helpful. The only way we can know to make sure that we provide the right type of podcast episodes, the right type of guests, and to make sure that we're delivering the type of content that you actually want to hear, it's through your reviews and through your support. Thanks, and now back to the episode.
I think what's also so relatable right now is just with when we see what's going on in the world in this moment specifically, and what's happening in the United States with immigration. So much of, I see it as I'm a third culture kid. I grew up moving around. I was exposed to a lot of cultures, and that's what makes it easier for me to understand, the experience of someone else. And well, I should say acceptance of someone else's experience and celebrating that. But in that, how have you been able to see how the South Asian community either turns their back to what's happening or leans in deeply? Because I see, both happening, right? And it's just this notion of like we've experienced it to some degree, but because we're removed, third generation, whatever it may be, obviously we weren't there in those moments, but we've heard stories. But how have you seen the South Asian community really, to your point, wanting to assimilate so badly to the culture of the majority that they are turning their backs on the experience of what it means to be an immigrant?
I mean, I think any immigrant that comes to this country has to sort of contend with, this flux in identity. And a lot of it depends on finding community, how you're treated, your experiences, and also, other factors like your education, your class, your caste. All of these things will also impact how you navigate the world of US systems. And there's so many systems to interact with. There are plenty of systems of oppression that we face, whether you're a child here going to school and trying to make friends, or in college, or in the workplace. And this is why, like, some people will reject the majority culture and kind of stay in their own communities and feel like, okay, this is how we preserve the culture. This is how we preserve our language, how we preserve values in our children. And they will only socialize within certain groups and not kind of, and then be cut off essentially. Whereas other folks will completely say, okay, we have to abandon everything we know and just, and it's a survival thing. So I don't judge it as good or bad. I think they're all just different ways that people cope. And depending on how much support you have, it can make or break your experiences. Like I said, I was very lucky in that when I moved here, I moved in with family first, and then I went to New York. So I had some time to kind of adjust to how things are done here. Just even the pace, how quickly things move and how you have to read the fine print for everything. And so there were a lot of cultural shocks that I had to adjust. And then, for my parents, it was a different experience, moving here as grown adults and, dealing with retirement, and then also figuring out, okay, how do we make friends here? And a lot of people will find ways to get involved in the community, whether it's through politics, whether it's through local activities, and other people are afraid to or feel unwelcome. They feel like there's no space for them. And so a lot of doors get shut in that process. I know I do a lot of work with international students and talking to them about those culture shocks and homesickness and trying to figure out where you fit in, why it's important to give yourself time and grace and not judge yourself, because that self-critical part can kind of take over and say, well, this is what your parents worked so hard to get you here, and now you're not making the most of it, or you're not happy, and what will your family say back home? All of those pieces lead to things like depression, anxiety, and a lot of international students too. So
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure that gets put onto that individual. I mean, I'm sure this is such a big part of the South Asian culture of, my parents came here, sacrificed so much. Like, what have I done? It's like, I need to be the ROI of their sacrifice, and if I have not bettered my life because of what they've done, then I'm a failure. And there's so much of that experience that individuals feel, immigrants feel, and second, third generation, whatever, it's passed down. When you think about it, because you talk a lot about, the work that is being done, it's not done in isolation, it's done in system. And we do have to look at the fact that even within this community of immigrants, of, whether it's South Asian or whether it's BIPOC in general, the LGBTQ community, a lot of things are being said and done to harm these individuals and these communities. So now there's like multiple layers on top of that you have to like shed, where they're already feeling a certain level of pressure that they have to be performing at. And then you add these extra layers of fear around them. How do we help individuals who aren't them come into the fold and understand this experience, to have more compassion, to understand that this person is just trying to get an education, just like everybody else. This person is simply trying to better their life also, just like your great grandparents did. I look at on TikTok, for example, and there'll be someone who's showing a post of, they're in Ireland and there's a beautiful greenery. And it's like, my great grandparents left this to go to Queens, New York or something. And it's like, yeah, but you're not asking why
mhm.
they left this, because no one leaves something beautiful and peaceful and relaxing and amazing to struggle for no reason. There was something there. So I see those and I understand what they're saying, like, oh my gosh, this is so much better than what we have going on right now in the US. But I find that there's a distance between the understanding of and experience of like what your great grandparents went through to get here and what that means. And I feel like that is where the disconnect sometimes happens with, when I think about like my nieces and when they have their kids and their kids, it's like there's going to be a further disconnect from them understanding the South Asian experience and
Yeah.
vice versa.
And I think so. The important thing is to start naming some of the systems of oppression, right? And I think, for example, with the South Asian community, one of the things that we come across is this model minority myth,
Oh, yeah.
right? And that is a real setup for failure, because the idea is that you are the model minority group. Look at these successful South Asians who are the CEOs of, IBM and Pepsi
Google.
or Google, and look at all these South Asian doctors here. They're the good ones, right? And they work hard, and that's how they contribute to our society. It hurts us because it sets us up to fail, because obviously not everyone is that stereotype. It keeps us separated from other people of color because it pits us against them, and that only reinforces the white majority culture. So it's problematic in various different ways, and sometimes we're not really aware of it. So when people come up against this, I think it creates the imposter syndrome, for example, right? Like, oh, I'm going to be found out that I'm not really as smart, but I'm supposed to be smart at math or this or that. And, science is supposed to be my thing, but I really actually want to go into the arts or creative writing or whatever. So all of this creates a lot of internal conflict and internal dissonance that hurts people in our communities.
And I think that we forget also that this idea about the South Asian, we only focus on Indian and Pakistani. We forget, like Nepalis get taken out of this, Fiji Indians, who were taken on as slaves to Fiji, to the Caribbean areas,
Mhm.
and became indentured servants. And something a lot of people don't realize is that when the slave trade stopped, that's actually when the South Asian slave trade began. And they had to find another route. And that's where that group is. I remember when I was practicing as a clinician in New York and doing home-based counseling, and this was my, reality myth busting moment with the model minority, is that I was working with Black kids, Puerto Rican kids, but then I remember I actually got 3 or 4 Fiji Indian kids. And
Hmm.
that was my first time actually experiencing, going into the homes of Fiji Indian, understanding the difference there, the Caribbean Indians. And it was it was eye-opening for sure for me as well, of recognizing, oh yeah, this has a much greater, effect and harm, because then those individuals are being pitted against, do we belong to this community that's being positioned as a model minority?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And this term South Asian didn't really even come about until the 18th century. People would identify themselves more as being Punjabi or Balochi or,
Gujarati or
that.
Tamil,
So
right?
when people ask where are you from, often that's at the heart of that question. Even in, I would say, my grandparents' generation, like they don't even really say India, Pakistan, right? Like they would say Bharat or Hindustan. And so there's lots of different ways in which language shifts when these things are happening.
And it's, you say that, right, about the South Asian terminology didn't even exist until the 18th century. And it's similar, like if you think about it, like white didn't really exist. That wasn't a part of the European language. That was something that, like, as you came to the United States, at some point Italians weren't considered white. At some point
Right.
Irish weren't considered white. And it's really this Anglo-Saxon looking at perspective. And when they say, okay, you're now accepted, okay, now you're now accepted. And so it creates that like hierarchy that I think, and as humans, like biologically, like we do need some form of hierarchy structure, but we've taken it and almost like created it for dehumanization.
Right. And even I have to be conscious of it because I used to use the term Desi a lot, but then I didn't realize that Desi actually doesn't apply to everybody who's South Asian. It's more particular to Northern Indians, right? Or so it excludes people who are from South India. They don't really identify because Desi comes from the word Desh, and that's a Hindi word or Urdu word. It's not, you don't see it in Tamil or some of the other languages. So I think it's important to consider, like, even within the South Asian diaspora, how much diversity there is and how, there's so many different languages and cultures and customs and, who's being excluded from those conversations.
I think that one of the most powerful things that you've probably experienced in your life, and I have, is that because of growing up the way that we did as third culture kids, growing up moving around from country to country, city to city, wherever it was, I was invited to iftar parties. I was invited to, Christmas. I was invited to these different events. And I remember feeling so excited when my friends found interest in coming to, like, oh, I want to come to Diwali. I want to come to, and your festives are they're so festive and they're so colorful and they're so this. And there's a shared experience in that I think that still is very prominent in what, when we think about the immigration experience of the United States, like that is what we say the celebration of immigrants, because they're bringing all of this together that has created the ultimate American culture to some degree. But what would you say that, for those who haven't had the experience that you and I had in terms of moving around and being able to, and they grow up in a more homogenous community, a homogenous neighborhood, how do they lean into becoming more curious about the celebration of difference versus being scared of it?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think, curiosity has to be cultivated and it doesn't have to be done in one particular way. There's no right way to learn about some of these differences, to learn about some of these similarities. But being curious, coming from a place that is non judgmental, especially if there are stories that in your family have been circulating about X group or Y group, and, you know, we have family members who are bigots. We have family members who might have very entrenched beliefs about caste or about skin color or about certain cultures. So understanding that, that may be something you heard growing up, but how can you challenge those beliefs? And like you said, it's the fear of the other that often gets in the way of building those bridges and having community, right? I think it's important to have, for me, Pakistani connections, but then it's also important for me to have South Asian connections because that bigger community feels receptive to me. But I know that for a lot of people, that hasn't been the case. And there's still conflict, whether it's the Hindu Muslim conflict or, the Rajasthani Gujarati conflict. Like there's so many different elements that hold people back. And especially if you're an immigrant living in the US, there's always strength in numbers. And so we really have to band together and not put aside our differences because I don't believe in sort of sugarcoating them, right? Like we have to talk about our own stuff too. Like that is important and have difficult dialogues. But it's almost like this idea that I talk about in couples therapy, right? Like you can't avoid the fights, but it's how you fight and how you repair that really makes or breaks are different. We can't expect fights to not happen. We can't avoid that. But how do we have space for difficult conversations and difficult dialogues? It has to be with curiosity. It has to be, just a little bit of flexibility and adaptability to say, okay, let me learn. And what are my preconceived notions? And how can I keep them? I could still hold them because fear is protective. So we can't completely abandon the fear either. But to say, okay, how can I stay open just enough to receive, whether that's new information, whether that's something that challenges something I strongly believe in or heard my whole life. So it's only through that process of learning from the other that, and being able to have spaces where those conversations are welcome and creating that sense of safety to be able to have those difficult conversations. And I think that's something that you clearly do. That's something that I try to do. So many people are now trying to just figure out how do we hold space for all of these different opinions and not come at each other, but come in a collective to understand and find alignment where we can.
I think something that you said though earlier ties really into the why having those difficult conversations, especially within, I wouldn't even say just South Asian, I think any collectivist cultural response has, is when our grandparents or great grandparents had to migrate and move, and through the partition, part of that also, that pain that they're carrying and that abandonment that they're carrying or the loss that they're carrying, that emotion of they now have to start somewhere, and will this community accept me? Will this community be, willing to make space for me? So this idea that has been passed down over and over again about just keep your head down, don't ruffle feathers, don't rock the boat, keep that space. Just make sure, like I notice, like I'm always so mindful, even when I travel and I go, one of my best friends always says I'm her favorite visitor because I'm so quiet. And like, it's like, she's like, when you come and you leave, she goes, you can't even tell that someone was there because the bed is always made. The suitcase is always like perfect. Like, I take out whatever I need. I make sure that I'm not taking up like all this space. And, I think that when you feel that you can take up all this space, it's because you feel safe to do so. And when you've had families that already had to go through the partition, and then on top of that, moved around, right, so much, and then immigrated to a completely foreign country like the US or Canada or UK, wherever, again, it's just that repeated pattern of how do I make sure that I'm accepted without taking up space. And when you don't take up space, that means like don't vocalize yourself, don't have opinions. If you have opinions, keep it to yourself, especially as a woman, as a South Asian, you get really, discouraged to speaking up. I know that has been definitely my experience growing up. Like I'm too chatty, I'm too this. It's like, well, guess what? It works for me now as a podcast host and as a speaker. But it really is that component of these adopted belief systems that we have because of what our generations of experiences have been through.
Right. Obedience is a great example, right? Like obedience and not questioning authority, not questioning your elders. Like that is a really big value that is shared among many different South Asian communities. And we see this in our families all the time. And, we see the older generation telling the younger generation constantly, like, oh, and we couldn't even talk back to our parents. We couldn't even look them in the eye. We couldn't speak up the way you do, but we see that there's value in speaking up. That can be done with respect, with openness, with curiosity. It doesn't have to be disrespectful. It doesn't have to be so combative or aggressive, but it doesn't have to be this quiet, passive existence either. How can we find that balance between passive and aggressive? Well, it's in the assertiveness, right? There
Yeah.
is a middle ground, but it can be done in different ways. And so when South Asian families are discussing the idea of boundaries, for example, or space or whatever it is, these are not, Western or Eastern things. It's just they're done in a culturally specific way, and we have to find that. And I often tell folks, don't confuse the larger culture at hand with the culture of your family. Your family has its own culture. There's no one way to do things as a Gujarati family or as a Sindhi family or as a Tamil family. Like lots of people do lots of different things. So sometimes, especially in immigrant families, the second generation will be like, well, this is just part of our culture. Uh-uh. It's not culture, it's the culture of your family. And that we need to look at.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. There's so many pieces to that because it really is. It's that piece of the culture of your family. And, so many times when you ask your parents, like, well, how come we do this? Well, we just do it.
Yeah.
And, because they didn't get to ask, right? And part of that, it's like, when I think about like, where does this whole thing of don't talk back or don't speak to your elders this way? I think there's an element, and I actually talk about this in a separate podcast episode, but there's an element of that person when you get reprimanded for asking questions, it's because they're not even comfortable with those. They haven't settled into it for themselves. They have unprocessed feelings and emotions about it. So now it's easier for them to say, how dare you ask that question, than it is for them to sit with it themselves.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it can be a sign of emotional immaturity at times. It can be a sign of other things. You
Yeah.
know, it depends on the context and the history of each family.
Amar, there's so many questions that I have left to ask you, and I feel like I'm gonna have to bring you back for another episode because I want to dive in deeper to like how you talk about decolonization of therapy and what that looks like different from cultural competence. There's so many layers, so we're gonna have to have you back. So beautiful about what you're studying and the curiosity of it, but it's deeply personal for me, and I feel just really eager to see what you come up with in your research, what you find, and however I can be a part of that, I want to, because I feel very strongly, and I will say this, that I am that person that in the uncle and aunties circle of group, like I will praise the other group that they want to
Yeah.
so deeply just hate, because
Yeah.
I find that I'm like, how can you hate about a space that your ancestors once lived in? I don't understand that. I don't understand how you can have you're the hate and the anger is being scapegoated to the wrong group. It should be towards, the oppressors and the ones who did this,
Right.
not towards the everyday community. So, anyways, I just want to say such a big thank you for you to come here. And I'm so excited about everything that you're doing. And one final question is, if
Mhm.
there was a reframe that you could have for communities to help them see that us coming together could be a much more powerful way of us, thriving, what would be the reframe perspective that you hope that your community and people in your audience, or even this audience that's listening to you right now, what is one reframe that they can have so that they can build more and lean more into, releasing that generational trauma?
I've thought about this a lot as I'm writing my book because initially I thought I was really exploring the past. But my sense of this book has become that it's really more about a warning for a lot of us. And what I saw happen in, India, Pakistan just a few months ago reminded me that if we don't heal these wounds, we will continue to perpetuate the cycle of hate, of stereotyping, of fear. And so we really need to break those cycles and we need to heal those wounds. And the healing happens on multiple levels. It happens within our families, it happens within our communities, and we have to have these conversations at home first, because that is where we learn and change and grow, and then we can start to change the minds of other people. So, breaking the cycle involves lots of different steps, but I think first we have to have these conversations at home.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ammara Khalid. Thank you so much for all of this. Where can people find you?
So you can follow me on Instagram. My handle is at dr.Ammara Khalid, or you can find me through my website, www.psychologicalservices.com. And you can also just Google search and find different articles that I've been quoted in, podcasts I've been on, things like that. And the book is going to be published through JKP, Jessica Kingsley Publishing. So I'm still in the early stages of it, but I will keep you posted on when it comes out.
Can't wait for all of that. And we'll definitely have all of these resources for them. But thank you so much again for being on. And we're definitely going to need to bring you back for so much more.
Thank you.
I really hope that you enjoy this episode. And I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode, and thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.